I even went ahead and turned this on because I got it just right.
Okay.
And so when he's done, everything goes in there.
Okay.
In that duffel bag.
Okay, so I assume there's a case for this and a case for this, and this just...
And a case for that, actually.
Oh, and a case for that. Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I can handle that.
And all the attached cords. But that one's not, this is ours, or is mine.
Is not?
Is not mine.
Okay.
Now, don't be surprised, because this is 50 feet long.
Okay, no
So
problem.
it goes snakes up there.
Okay.
So, that's it.
All right. Oh, look at that. Straight on. You got it.
Yeah. As long as he doesn't start moving around.
Okay, so
You know what? If he starts moving around, that's on him.
Okay. All right.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, cool.
All right. Thank you. And I'll holler at the end of the week and we can get together for coffee or something maybe next weekend.
Okay.
I'll pick it all up.
Okay, or lunchtime sometime.
Yeah.
During the week, whatever.
Okay. Well, cool. All right, man. Oh, let me tell him who you are.
All right.
Hey, man.
Send it to me, and I just want to get his direct email. Sure. I'm gonna set this down.
If you have something to eat or drink, please make your way back to your seats. When I was 12 years old, I read my first, or I memorized, deliberately memorized my first poem at the age of 12. It was the first time that I had read a poem that resonated with me. And it was a very simple poem, you know, outside of Dr. Seuss. But it was a very simple poem. I'm going to give it to you right now. An emerald is as green as grass, a ruby red as blood. A sapphire shines as blue as heaven, a flint lies in the mud. A diamond is a brilliant stone to catch the world's desire. An opal holds a fiery spark, but a flint holds fire. Now, for a 12-year-old, that was deep. That was really deep. I thought, yeah, you know, there was meaning here. That's when I first realized that what really poetry is, and poets, is not just words on paper. It's not just a story. And I shouldn't say just because I write stories. I love stories. There's a lot of people talking loudly out there. Thank you. Poetry and poets don't just know the language, they don't just like to read, and they don't just write. They have to know words so well that with very few words, they can convey a whole meaning and diversity of meanings, each individual to individual people. So we have today Dan Wetmore, who is a member of the SouthWest board, to talk about the challenges that poetry readers and writers face. He is a retired Air Force officer who, finding himself with time on his hands, took to working to transform a lifelong avocation into a second vocation. He's been a member of SouthWest Writers for 3 years and has published a book of poetry, My Mother's Gentle Unbecoming, The Absentings of Alzheimer's, which is in a 4-way tie for first place in the New Mexico Arizona Book Awards, and has poems and short stories that appear in various collections. Dan Wetmore is, I thought he was next to me. He's running away. Okay, so at any rate, including high school and college literary anthologies, the St. Andrews Review, and most recently the SouthWest Writers Sage Anthology. Dan is currently working on his first novel and is going to be talking about the pros and cons of non-prose. Dan Wetmore.
Despite conflicting appearances, poets are a shy bunch, so please no sudden movements. Now, this will be kind of interesting, half heavily scripted, half impromptu, because I'm a procrastinator by nature, and a lot of you know the appeal of that. Is this loud enough? Can you hear me? Yes. I'll make sure. The appeal of procrastination is if you wait till the last minute, it only takes a minute. However, I really actually wanted to do a good job with this, so I made the mistake of starting early, which gave me a legitimation to my predilection for putting things off, because I found out a horrifying corollary. If you start early, the project will grow to consume all available time. So what I ended up with was 16 single-spaced pages of presentation to give to you. And during the read-through, that came in about an hour and 15 minutes. And as I know that brevity is the soul of keeping the audience non-hostile, I said, okay, I'll just cut off the first half and throw it in the trash. Which meant that I was going to talk about the prose of poetry. And it's good. Not that I have a preference or anything like that. But I thought, well, yeah, that might do the job. And then I asked Rose, because I thought, oh, okay, I got about 20, 25 minutes. And then I asked Rose, and she said, well, about 45 minutes. So I'm hoping to split the difference. So if this looks ugly, that's why. So yes, the pros and cons of non-pros. And that's
No cons.
I told you. Flexibility is the key to air power. So first the cons, because we want to end on a positive note. And we'll start with the cons for the potential reader, because there are pros and cons for both the reader and the writer. There are challenges to getting read and just to getting written. And this kind of sums it up, a meme I found on the internet. For those of you who can't read this, 1 in 5 teenagers will experiment with poetry. Rhyming is a gateway to sonnets. I found drafts in her bedroom. How long have you been free versing? They've noticed you thinking. I checked online, it's Dickinson. Poetry, know the signs. So, this is sort of a free-floating version of poetry that you encounter in a lot of corners, a stereotype that attacks it. But it has its basis in some very concrete reservations about the craft. The content's unappealing. That's one of the claims. Some say, tongue-in-cheek, it must be poetry because I don't understand it. Some say that in all seriousness. It's obtuse, it's abstract. It's just hard to get into. It's too brief. It's like prose with holes, and it's esoteric. It's self-absorbed. It's about things that nobody can do anything about anyway. So why bother? It's about things that it's opinions for which there are no real truths, and so there's no edification in the reading. It's just your opinion versus mine, and everybody's got noses. Some just smell better than others. So for these reasons, people say it just kind of turns me off. It may be foreign to the reader's actual psyche. One walks away from the table still hungry. I know I do. I spend more time reading prose than I do poetry, and it's hard to shift gears. So when I sit down to read a book of poetry, cover to cover, just in one sitting because of the shorter word count, I just consume each selection like a potato chip. And then I get to the end of the book and I look down and the bag's empty and I'm disgusted with myself for having, just not paced myself, and for the fact that it's all gone. So it's challenging that way. We live in a world where, everything is supersized. You go to Amarillo and you get yourself a 72-ounce steak, and all the fixings to go with it. You go to the convenience store and you got the 50-gallon Big Gulp to go with it. We Americans have really big appetites, and prose feeds those appetites nicely. But poetry, if writing was like alcoholic beverages, I think prose would be like a keg of beer at a fraternity party. Drink until you're full, immerse yourself in the situation, seek an alternate reality for a moment. Whereas poetry would be more like, an aperitif, a thimble glass of after-dinner sherry, or a snifter of brandy that you sit in your wingback chair by the crackling fire in your favorite smoking jacket and squirt and sniff. Reggie in his 4x4 that's about 3 stories high rumbling down Central, he's just not going to be a big fan. The joke here was that, as again, I'm just freewheeling here, the joke was that it's like hors d'oeuvres, and even if hors d'oeuvres weren't hard to spell, they still wouldn't be appealing to the American appetite. And for those of you who know, this is misspelled, by the way.
Yes.
So yes, less quality control with poetry than with prose. Now why is that? Well, number one, there are fewer rules governing the genre, and so it's the Wild West, which makes it a good place to write poetry. So there are fewer constraints. You can't do this, can't do that, can't do that. Every rule is meant to be broken, and poetry is meant to break every rule, I think. And so that's a challenge on the part of the reader. So there's less internal policing when it comes to the material. There's also less external policing, especially in this day and age with the shift in paradigm in publishing to publishing on demand. Because back in the days with traditional publishing, to mitigate the fact that you had to sell on prospect, you didn't know if the thing that you were going to run 100,000 copies of was going to make it on the New York Times bestseller. You had to make sure that it was a good product before it got out the door. So you had the professional editors looking over it with their practiced eyes and saying, yeah, scratch this, add this, squeeze, shrink, stretch. These days with publishing on demand, if you got a buck and you're willing to buy a book and you, the author, are the audience, it'll get published, typos and warts and all. And so this is especially true with, it plagues both poetry and prose, but it's especially true of poetry because poetry has a short word count, fewer pages, but you're still going to charge that author the same $5 or $10 per book. And guess what? You're using half the actual resources, ink and paper, to do it. So your highest profit margin as a publisher-on-demand publisher is for the poetry stuff. So yeah, it'll get out there, and that gives the reader less assurance than ever that they're getting a quality product. It's too confusing because it is prose with holes. And a lot of readers don't want to take the time to fill in the gaps. So as Ambrose Bierce said, Devil's Dictionary author, really an acerbic kind of guy, poetry, a form of language, is peculiar to the land beyond the magazines. E.B. White, Charlotte's Web. Poets dare to be just so clear, no clear. They unzip the veil from beauty, but do not remove it. Lingerie for the soul? I don't know. A poet is a liar who always speaks the truth. Okay? And you could probably flip that phrase and people would still buy it. It takes too much work. Oh my gosh. Don't know what the author meant. Was he really talking about X, or was it an extended metaphor for something else? Was he being literal, was he being figurative? Where was he being which? This is a challenge, and it's an insurmountable one with the craft. But I have to confess, it's one for which I have no sympathy whatsoever. Partially for the sake of self-preservation of my ego, but mainly because think of poetry, think of writing as like going on to Match.com, a dating website. You're trying to establish a readership. You're trying to establish a relationship with readership. Do you really want to be in a relationship with a person who just expects you to do all of the work, who wants you to hand it to them? We do live in an age and a society where it's gratification on demand, instantaneous. So you stream video on demand, you get your music downloads right then. All these things just come to you, and it's a very passive mode that we've gotten into. So a lot of people don't any longer have the mental muscle to meet you halfway when it comes to your writing. But that's what you want in a relationship. You want somebody who's going to be as invested in it as you are. And if they're not, maybe it's just not for that particular reason. You never know what you're going to get. Yeah. When somebody's writing poetry or prose, and you ask a fiction writer, a prose writer, what do they write? They're going to say, I write mystery, science fiction, cookbooks, death, fantasy, how-to, biography, history, spirituality, westerns, romance, children's stories, essays, air traffic control. It could happen. Health and wellness, inspirational, mold. You ask the poet what they write. So, try this thought experiment. Say you're at a book fair, and you're a prose writer. You say, and somebody comes up and says, "So tell me about your book." No sweat. Well, it's sort of like Dashiell Hammett meets Quentin Tarantino. It's a rollicking sort of mystery with lots of zany characters and wicked dialogue, but with a kind of a self-effacing spin on the whole genre. You can do that. It's no problem. Now, say you go to the poet who's right next to him, or more likely, back in the alcove by the bathrooms with the rest of the poets. And you go up and you say, and you're that person at that table with your books, all your flat, square babies that you painfully gave birth to. And somebody comes up to you and they say, "So what's your book about?" And you say, "Well, it's a book of prose. Would you like to buy it?" "Well, what's it about?" "Well, it's about 300 pages. "So what's the subject?" "Well, it's just prose, and it's got all these nice words, and right and left hand justified, so it's very good looking stuff." The problem between poetry and prose is that poetry suffers from a marketing problem. Prose and poetry only talk about the form, the physical layout of the stuff on the page. Whereas what we really want to know is, what's the content? And only prose speaks to that. So you look on the back of a book of prose, it's got key words. It's a list of ingredients like on a package in the grocery store. You look on the back of a book of poetry, and it's this effusive, flowing, sort of vague, and maybe even sinister recommendation for the author, telling what they're all about. And if you're like me, just sort of suspicious by nature, you ask yourself, what are they trying to hide by not just speaking plainly? And I don't know why we do that. Except maybe because in the real world, it's all shades of gray. So between those two extremes of poetry and prose, you've got prosaic poetry and poetic prose. And maybe us poets, we realize that the only thing worse than, I don't know, having a minimal identity is to lose all identity from assimilation into that vast gray of undifferentiated stuff. And only philosophers like myself are masochistic enough to want to live in that particular world. So. And there are cons for the would-be writers, as I said. The market's saturated due to the greater ease of writing. Writing poetry is easy. Writing good poetry, not necessarily. So there's a lot out there. And as said, there are fewer gates, there are fewer restraints on the system, there are fewer quality checks in the process to make sure that whatever's getting out there is good. And so it's buyer beware. And again, I spoke ahead of myself due to the POD environment, published on demand. So let me give you a couple of anecdotes at the risk of shooting my career in the heart, professionally in front of all of you. There's a bookstore in town which is renowned to be a friend of the writer, and so I went to them to try to set up a reading. And when they said, "Well, what are you writing?" I said, "Poetry." The walls went up before the last syllable was out of my mouth, and they said, "We don't do that stuff." Okay. There's another establishment in town which has a practice of showcasing local authors. And they set up a table right in the middle of the store, prime viewing area, with all the books by those folks. And I wish Steve hadn't pointed to himself. Because I wasn't done with the story.
Oh, okay.
But when it got to the point where they had too many authors to accommodate on that table, they had to move some of the stuff. Could have done it any number of ways, alphabetically, size, color, hardback, softback, you name it. They decided to segregate the poetry from the prose. And the prose got put on a bookcase right beside that table. So while you have all these books of prose, the things with the complete sentences and the paragraphs and the chapter headings, sitting there on the table with their bright, smiling, wide faces shining up at the authors, beckoning, come get me. You have these little thin books of poetry with their sharp, anonymous backs coldly to the author sitting on that shelf. And so, there really is something worse than judging a book by its cover, judging it solely on its Dewey Decimal classification. And yes, within the Dewey Decimal system, there's only one subheading of one category dedicated to poetry. What can I say? Melville Dewey was a mean man. Or a homophobe at the very least. Now, please don't get me wrong. Please don't think that I'm biting the hand that feeds us, because it's really not that. It's a different perspective. When the work is aware, a W-A-R-E, you feed most those which feed you. If positions were reversed, I would do exactly the same. And this isn't meant to discourage you from writing poetry. It's actually meant to inoculate you and just to tell you, go in with eyes wide open. If that's the route you want to take, fine. Just realize that in the battle of the books, at least in this century, prose has got a head start. It's a pitched battle, and if you're a poet, you're starting off on the low ground. So just be aware of that. Putting it in the terms of the economics that I alluded to, all these cons for the potential reader, they essentially create low demand, or that's what they result in. Whereas the cons for the writer tend to create high supply. And as every student of Economics 101 knows, when you mix low demand with high supply, the result is a devaluation of the commodity. Not a making it unimportant, just making it less valuable in the mind of the person who's the potential buyer. So, again, the philosophy, my apologies. But there are pros. Take heat, take joy, take heart. The cavalry has arrived. And now I gotta switch screens. And we'll start with the poets. For one thing, the white space offers more varied pacing and expression. Wasn't meant to be a joke, but I will take it. poetry's exclusive, and now I'll get boring because I'm just going to be reading. And that's poetry's exclusive latitude to play with its words not only audibly but visually, owing to its usually shorter word count, which translates to more white space on a page. Borrowing from the terminology of the visual arts regarding this hybrid with the verbal ones, the reduced number of words, the figure, creates the opportunity for the white space, the ground, to become a figure in its own right. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Good. Now with prose, we're limited to this. The white space is just a border, not engaged in any interplay with the words, just corralling them, circumscribing, keeping them in check like a prison's walls, lest they get lawless and, heaven forbid, try to wander off seeking more full expression. Poetry, if I can force synesthesia to serve as a metaphor, affords a sort of visual onomatopoeia. Like, yeah, it gets wacky from here. Like those words which mimic the sounds they represent, the white space echoes the character of the words it sponsors, an added dimension to convey pacing. Or emphasis, where the poet isn't afforded enough words to have them do that for themselves. It can be purely whimsical, laughing at the very notion of uniformity, which is the hallmark of the long line stuff. In prose, the visceral arrangement of the words is an after effect of a preset standard. In poetry, the desired shape may actually drive their selection, such as this. It's not one of mine. I don't. Not my forte, but yeah, some people enjoy doing this. Or take this one, Iceberg. This is one written by my older brother in high school. Iceberg. You reminded me of nothing so much as a revolving iceberg, 9/10 below the surface, little features rising to the top momentarily, then sinking out of sight to be replaced with others. It must be heaven, hell, being able to hide, trapped under the surface like that. So, with that one, the arrangement of the words on the page, thumbing its nose at prose's linear constraint, is able to literally underscore the opposing perspectives of being simultaneously transparent and opaque to characterization, amplifying the power of the iceberg as extended metaphor. Hard to do with prose. The next was the lament of a younger, single self, pining for the company of a significant other. Lonely is never any but only, solely is ever and always unholy. Given the temptation to speed through such a small number of words, the breaking of the lines and stretching them out helps to slow the pace of the reading, and by putting them all removed from each other, underscores the overall sentiment of isolation. And next is an excerpt from a poem written on the eve of my mother's last night in my parents' home before being moved into a residential facility for Alzheimer's patients, an attempt to give those final moments the recognition I felt they were due. And not having learned that last and lasting lie when they tout themselves anyway relations, we gather up each falling moment like the pieces of a prized china plate. We hold, we count them all, trying to see what was and what isn't, and wish ourselves insensible. Last seat at this table, last hand on this glass, last holding of this cat, last look out this window, last laugh on these walls, last tread on the stair, last cheek on this pillow, last lying next to this man, last dawn creeping in, last turn of this latch, last push of this door, last gaze on this lawn. The meandering slide of the words, dribbling from the end of the page, strives to convey a trailing off, a loss of direction and energy, emotional deflation, acquiescence to an unturnable dissipation. And this next was written to my wife during a 1.5-year deployment in response to one of her frequent letters. 1700 mail called in Incirlik, Turkey. Your words paint a picture, but mind's eye sees a window, and the focal depth of 10 inches becomes 7,000 miles. but I injudiciously dropped the page before my preoccupation, raised my eyes before my defenses, and the distance, proximity, to here, there, appears, disappears, with alarming, astonishing alacrity, clarity, and I wonder the wonder of all. And here, in the shoreless midst of the other, midst the immensity of the known, which, despite, due to, remove, eclipses that. So, putting certain words in opposition to each other, facing off across the page that way, is meant to emphasize the jarring juxtaposition of perspectives, the dizzying effect of trying to hold such disparate circumstances in simultaneous consideration. But for all you non-poets out there, why should you even care about any of this? It's a valid question. When I was pitching this talk, I claimed that you should, so now it's time to put up or shut up if I don't want to be accused of pulling a bait and switch. So does poetry really offer benefits to non-poets as well? Oh, I forgot one. The last benefit of poetry, given its smaller size, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now. Given its smaller size, it's more portable and it can be more ubiquitous. There are more surfaces which can hold a poem than prose. You know, for instance, the trees in the bike park, which will be holding haikus next month. Or this, since I already gave away the punchline. Because nobody's schedule has enough time in the gym to get laughs wide enough to hold an entire chapter by Emily Bronte. So, for poets, what for you as well? The two seem alien, not only in their aims and their approaches, so it seems like a stretch. But poetry does, owing to an easily forgotten fact, that every form of writing can serve two functions. Either as an enterprise, an end unto itself, or as an exercise, a means to a further end. On behalf of the poets, you're welcome. Because regarding poetry and prose, I don't think both are making equal contributions to the relationship. I think the writer of prose profits more from the practice of poetry than the poet profits from the practice of prose. And it makes a good tongue twister. Now, I don't want to overstate the case. Practicing poetry won't teach you new skills because the elements found in poetry are a subset of those found in prose, but it'll improve your command of existing skills, those common to both. So what am I getting at? Well, briefly, let's talk brevity, concision. You all know what excruciating exercise it is to try to come up with an elevator pitch which captures the full magnificence of your opus. Rightfully so. But what if the entire work, what if everything you wrote was limited to the length of an elevator pitch and had to stand on the merits of those 60 seconds of syllables alone? How much discipline would that demand of and bestow on you? Because that's the level of concision required to become adept at poetic expression. And even if you care nothing for the product, you'll love the payoff. The dividend of making your prose more lean, mean, and to the point. After all, poetry is the original flash fiction. Not the Johnny-come-lately stuff the short attention audiences are currently moving over. Take the poetry form known as waka, W-A-K-A, for instance. 31 letters to convey something of substance. Not this 1,000-word cushion for the indecisive, divagating novice who still has training wheels on the word processor. Kidding. So even if you're a practitioner of the long line, even if poetry has no inherent appeal to you, it still offers an instrumental value. You can benefit from it the way a classical violinist benefits from warming up on arpeggios before tackling a sonata, refreshing and strengthening individual muscle memories, practicing the elemental techniques which are the building blocks of even the most ambitious pieces. But it's no coincidence that concision bears so much family resemblance to the word confusion, because concision is the natural enemy of completeness. So, to compensate for that negative aspect of brevity, poetry, of necessity, has to promote an increased opposing tug toward clarity. All writing is a tightrope if you're pulled in different directions. And if you're going to get shorter, it's harder to stay astute, for lack of a better word. And so clarity is the next thing. And clarity expresses itself in two ways, through the conjoined twins of denotation and connotation. And regarding denotation, every word in poetry, statistically, is more crucial. Think of it as a tune being sung by an a cappella soloist. Any wrong note is going to stand out glaringly. Whereas a novel, with as many voices, is more like a full orchestra. A misfingering by the third chair flautist is going to be concealed by the oboes and trumpets. The full-bodied nature of prose insulates any particular word from misunderstanding. The luxury of all that lush context can serve as a crutch for the prose writer, or compensate for an undiscerning eye, or laziness, or haste, sheltering them from criticism by giving their readers the ability to bleep over a wrong word, unconsciously forgiving the writer for their imprecision, realizing they meant to say envious when what they actually wrote was jealous. You've heard the expression, many hands make light work? That's an apt description of prose. For poetry, the watchword, on the other hand, is few syllables make a heavy load. If writing were a river crossing, prose would be a 4-lane paved bridge with guardrails, and poetry would be a thin meander of stepping stones. A lot less margin for error with a ladder, forcing you, encouraging you to watch your step. So, to avoid getting wet, for example, don't say number when you mean numeral, or progress when you should have said progression, or farther instead of further, or may when you meant might, or versus rather than vice, or should instead of shall, or shall instead of will, or will when you should have said would, or ambiguous when you meant vague, compliment instead of compliment, accept instead of accept, effect instead of affect, last where you should have said past, precede when you meant proceed, sympathy instead of empathy, or condescend in place of patronize. Just examples of things to keep track of, and there are many of them out there. Moving on to connotation. To distinguish connotation from denotation, inaccuracy in denotation means choosing the wrong word. Inaccuracy in connotation means not choosing the best word. It might seem like a subtle distinction. It might seem like a subtle distinction, but like many of those, it's significant. If you were at the West Mesa shooting range, bad denotation would be like hitting the target of the guy next to you. A definite faux pas. I don't know from personal experience, thankfully. Choosing the wrong connotation would be hitting your own target, but barely making it on the paper. Not as bad, but still an embarrassment. Think back to high school biology and the microscopes we used. Denotation and connotation are like the coarse and fine adjustment knobs on those. Avoiding the wrong words brings your position into the field of view. Capturing the right ones gets it in sharp focus. Precise engineering requires precision tools. Imagine trying to machine a replacement part for an automobile engine, and the only measuring device you have at your disposal is a yardstick. That crankshaft connecting rod or cam lobe has to be machined to tolerances within a few thousandths of an inch, and the best you can approximate is 16ths. It's the same with language. And poetry, the most Spartan of speech, requires you to find not just an acceptable word, an adequate word, or a good word, even a great word, but the word. The word which generates a resonant frequency when it hits the tuning fork of your ear, causing you to vibrate in sympathetic harmony. For example, this is my most succinct expression to date of the mixed emotions which I, a 55-year-old married man, feel when an attractive young woman walks into Starbucks, which is why I should just avoid Starbucks. Because that's where they go. I think that's why Mark Halperin says, stay out of the cafes if you want to be a serious writer. Too much distraction. Anyway, it's entitled The Eyes Have It Because I Like Planes. I can't but stare and apologize and refuse because there's no excuse and every reason. So, now what if instead of stare, it read leer? You hear it? That's not quite right. Like staring, leering crosses a line, but unapologetically, unabashed, even proud of the fact. And that would leave no room to feel any sympathy for the writer, no sense that he's struggling to have his better nature triumph over base instincts. How about gaze? It's not as bad as leering, an act that any but the socially unconscious would know is likely to give offense, but still bad, because the one gazing has an aspect of inviting, which implies a belief on the one doing the gazing that they think that there's really a chance, that there are no barriers to the situation that they desire, which shows them to be, at a minimum, self-deluded. And again, kills any sympathy you might have for the author, hopefully. What about glance? Well, the problem is with glances, it's too far in the other direction. It's so brief, so minimal intent, it doesn't give rise to the level of creep factor. It's a complaint here that warrants apology in the first place. How about glimpse? Glimpse isn't even count as necessarily a conscious act. It's not looking to or at, just happening to see without any implied effort or desire to do so. So it's apropos of nothing. So it's just got to be the word. In a similar vein, the dissolution of days. I remember when I stood in the middle of my room at night, in the dark, and cried because my mother wasn't there and wasn't coming. The next morning, I woke and wrote these words and wondered that it's not just one's own last days which will call one's first. And wondered more, if we can be reduced to former states, why can't we be returned to? Any power that this poem might hold, it hinges on two words that are hidden deep in the work, so they can jump out and surprise the reader when their guard is down. At first glance, reduced and return look like near synonyms, because reducing is one form of return. But the effects described are polar opposites, and if that much effect can be drawn from so little, writers of prose should revel in anticipation of just how much so much more might give. So, if you get in the habit of agonizing over every word you put on the page, it'll admittedly take you 5 times as long to get anything written. But the nagging of the internal editor, keeping you awake while you're writing, will drown out the internal critic, who would otherwise have kept you awake from the moment you finished, and forever after. That's the hope anyway. Some people write off that level of preoccupation with precision and splitting hairs, but it's not. It's the difference between splitting hairs and separating ones which are lying very close to each other. There is a difference, but a lot of people lack the keenness of vision to discern it. So think of the mind's eye like a physical one, and think of dictionaries like eye charts. Whereas ophthalmology charts contain letters which serve as an eye test to measure visual acuity and reveal color blindness, dictionaries contain words which serve as an espy test to measure mental perspicuity and reveal conceptual confusion. I like parallels. And to write and to bring some more from that metaphor, it's not just about seeing how keen or not so keen your vision is, but improving it. Because ophthalmology doesn't just say, yep, you're blind, they try to fix you, make you better. And in a nutshell, it comes down to this. The complexity of thought we can achieve is limited to our ability to express. And our ability to express is constrained by the fullness of our speech. Whether it's sufficiently nuanced to capture subtleties, sometimes very proximals. And that, to me, is crucial. The cause and effect in these matters is not, as many assume, that deep thoughts will drive melodious words. It's actually the opposite. Not having the command of highly nuanced words prevents the most profound thoughts from ever being birthed. And given the extremes poetry will drive you to, I believe if you practice it, you'll glimpse the best writer you can be, and having done so, will develop a healthy and abiding anxiousness lest you fail to become that self. It sound far-fetched? Good. Because consider when you walk into a Sherwin-Williams store and walk over to the rack holding all the sample paint cards, there are 47 shades of white. Everything from blizzard to eggshell to tapioca to exsanguinated vampire victim to ghost in neon tan. I can't tell them apart. Hold up anyone in isolation, it looks identical to all the rest. But put two of them side by side in just the right light, and then it's, oh yeah, now I see it. And there's a word for that, let the logic go. And I just know there's going to come a day when I find myself struggling to find the word that means struggling to find a word, and that is going to drive me crazy. So consider this description of a derelict mansion. The old plantation house seemed to slump under the heavy patina of years. Detached frames of eyebrow windows, warped and twisted by untold, unpainted days, gave the once stately facade the look of a leering drunk. Some of the capitals of the wooden columns which once shouldered the porch roof had fallen, loosely encircling their bases like the sport hose of an old woman down around her ankles. The eyes of all but the uppermost windows had been put out by neighborhood boys learning their aim, the jagged panes and splintered muntins now staring vacantly into a phantom past. Now, if that's a description that you want to give, if that's a picture that you want to paint for your reader, unless you know certain key terms like eyebrow windows and capitals and muntins, those little cross pieces of wood between the individual pieces of glass and all the windows, you're not going to be able to paint the picture that they want to see. Now, will trying to achieve that level of authenticity occasionally risks sending a reader to the dictionary? Oh, yes. And is that a bad thing? Oh, no. If they only bought your book for entertainment and you offered them edification as well, you've gone above and beyond the call. They got more than they paid for. So what's the complaint about? Will your attempts at erudition potentially subject you to the criticism of trying to look smart? To make your reflections just a reflection on you? Yes. And if the accusation is true, take your lumps and go and sin no more. But if it's not, grow a thick skin and press on. And how do you know which is which? If you're putting the words for yourself first. How can you tell if the writing is genuine or affected if you're in love with the subject or just the sound of your own voice? I believe the quality control mechanism, the question that needs to be running on a continuous loop in the back of our minds is, am I writing this in order to draw attention to myself or despite the danger that I might? If the former, rework your material to excise the ego. If the latter, let it stand, critics be damned. Your attitude is an acid test. Do you approach the writing with arrogance or humility? At the point you start to believe you're your own muse, you'll be doing a disservice to your readers and the craft. So always ask, are the words pulling me, or am I trying to push them? So at the risk of seeming insouciance, my response to that potential criticism of my readers is brusquely unapologetic. It's simply this: because I respect you, I refuse to talk down to you. I'll treat you as an equal and as one who's interested and engaged. Otherwise, you wouldn't be spending your time in the company of books in the first place. For me to assume otherwise would be to insult your intelligence. I'm not going to do that. If I'm going to err, and as said, writing is nothing if not a tightrope, better that I err on the side of getting offense rather than getting it. My writing might invite you to think poorly of me, but better that than give false impression than that I think poorly of all of you. And for those who don't want to engage in poetry merely for the sake of prose without the sacrifice they made on behalf of their art being credited, the short line stuff can make cameo appearances alongside its margin-busting brethren. A little bit of something other to season the page and give a respite from unwavering margins, providing a visual counterpoint to break up that potential monotony. As an example, this is an excerpt from a novel in progress, which the protagonist, an expatriate of Middle Eastern origin, is journaling one evening, expressing his longing for his true love, a woman named Amsha, still residing in the Arabian Peninsula, trying to pay homage to her spirit and inner beauty. Looking back and sensing the cat would readily oblige, Ibrahim extended his raised hand. Then, if you'd be so kind. Bis hesitated but a moment. Bis is Egyptian for cat. Bis hesitated but a moment before completing the high five with the interest of a needle-pricked index finger, anesthetized with a low purr growl muffled behind half-closed eyes. Ibrahim drew back his digit and applied it brush-like to the page before him, shading the lines there with forward punctuation. Bis looked askance. You suppose crimson a proper tribute? Not true to the form, unless gold or silver. Ibrahim sighed at the cat's rebuking devotion to the art, apologizing via protest. I give what I have. Ask of the uncounted stars and their long-sealed treasure, how more numerous the gazers, imploring the measure. Many the man's soul cries into the void for their sight. Shall the burning of need suffice to banish that night? Hear the coos of the earthbound angels of heaven. Allah grants but softest echoes, which themselves nearly deafen. The counterpoint created by embedding poetry and prose is quite emphatically, yet gently, grabs the reader by the shoulder and says, pay attention, this is the important part. The black italics is an extended question in 6 lines, truly posed as a question. And reading down the blue first words of each removes any cryptic ambiguity by synopsizing an acrostic which constitutes a Reader's Digest condensed version of the poem's query. Then, focusing more tightly on the red first letters of those, we get an acrostic within an acrostic, which renders the whole period rhetorical by providing a single word answer, identifying one person, at least, whose purity of nature makes her worthy of and fitted to the inestimable gift of receiving God's words directly without being obliterated by the power of such an experience. And I don't know of any way that prose alone can allow you to achieve that triple nested effect without spoon-feeding the reader to the point of insulting their intelligence in the process. Another example, last example. Later, following the news of her death, the protagonist, Ibrahim, finds that engaging in a flight of verse is the best vehicle to give wing to his grief. Ibrahim realized that he now knew full the devastation of Winston and Julia in George Orwell's 1984, the betraying of a heart being the death of deserving. But doubly, when the denier, like the Apostle Peter, denounces despite protestation as they never would. Trebly, when the other in the relation keeps faith. Reaching the coffee table where his clipboard lay ever at the ready, Ibrahim took it up, and casting for comfort, devolved into simple keening, a wail of words leaking out through clenched fingers. Can one again see colors from whose heart all light's been bled? Can one ever hear notes from whose soul music has fled? Any purpose for scent when the only perfume's a burial murder? Any promise left in touch when all touch was of her? Will there once again be taste for lips which have lost their kin? What are the hours that were ours when every now's become then? What the sense incenses when the world has lost its mind? That you, from me, it would keep so unkind. Crying in public is often a source of embarrassment for both the agent and those made audience, and the shared page is a public forum, but the shift of poetry gives the reader a warning, a little break, a chance to shift gears, buckle up, brace yourself, it's coming. And somehow, I think, italics softens what's in danger of spilling over into melodrama, making the reader more charitable to giving the benefit of the doubt. So that's the pros and cons. And just to sum up on a more egalitarian note, maybe, moving beyond the partialities of poetry and prose, I'd like to end with some general encouragements to authorship, no matter what form it takes. In writing, to seek to wind the words as tightly as possible and fit them together like the gears and springs of a Swiss watch makes each work a champagne bottle, to mix metaphors. Just waiting for a reader's opening to effervesce and flow into every corner of consideration. And for my money, that's a prize worthy of pursuit. But even if that never occurs, if your work's never published, never read by the world at large, only tucked away in a desk drawer to be found by a granddaughter or great nephew who hasn't yet been born, an audience so small and distant you can't see it, your memories and musings on those pages will give them more connection to you and where they came from, a greater sense of who you were and they are than any number of photographs in a family album. And worst case scenario, even if that doesn't occur, and it all evaporates with your passing, if your papers are consigned unread to a dumpster by busy or apathetic children who come to clean up what they consider the detritus of your life so they can get back to theirs. My wife tells me that repeatedly that she's looking forward to a big bonfire of all my stuff. Me included. And if I'm nice, she'll wait till after I'm dead. Even if your opus is like a magnum of champagne from the stores of the Titanic's larder, doomed to rest forever on the floor of the North Atlantic, 2 miles deep in the dark and silt and cold, its envisioned function never fulfilled, the effort is still far from wasted. Because even if no one else is, the Creator, at least, is improved by the creation. The mere act of reflecting, considering, coming to terms with, will force you to hone your mental acuity and imbue you with broader perspective and offer opportunities for closure you might have been denied otherwise. And by trying on the perspectives of others, bring increased empathy. It will pay dividends in every aspect of your life. Will have you, the person who wrote but was never read, acting with a greater sense of purpose and more confidence. For having discerned your path, the steps beyond, the steps already behind and those yet ahead, more clearly than we would had you not dared the battlements of the blank page. Just realize that, having gained that illumination, you'll have incurred an obligation to work to light others' journey as they attempt to navigate life's sometimes rocky path. If not through your words, at least through your newfound ways. So let me leave you with words by Martha Graham, a dancer by profession, in a letter to a fan. They elevate me when I feel my confidence or energy flagging. There is a vitality, a life force, an energy, a quickening that is translated through you into action. And because there's only one of you in all of time, this expression is unique, and if you block it, you will never exist through any other medium, and it will be lost. The world will not have it. It is not your business to determine how good it is, or how valuable, or how it compares with other expressions. It is your business to keep it yours, clearly and directly, to keep the channel open. You do not even have to believe in yourself or your work. You have to keep yourself open and aware of the urges that motivate you. Keep the channel open. No artist is ever fully pleased. There is no lasting satisfaction, whatever, at any time. There is only a queer, divine satisfaction, a blessed unrest that keeps us marching and makes us more alive than the others. So what questions do you have? Going once, going twice. Yes, Arlene.
Yeah, could you speak on experimental prose? I know in Poetry Magazine out of Chicago, they're featuring prose now in the midst of poetry.
And that to establish my ignorance, you said experimental prose.
Yes.
I think yes, one of those shades of gray I referred to. I know nothing of it myself, being not as well read as I should be to be a writer. But I welcome such a thing because I think that to stereotype and draw the lines and the divisions and the battle lines, if you will, it's divisive. It doesn't do anything positive for anybody. So I'm for it, but I don't know any of the particulars of it.
It's sort of like modern art. You don't always understand it, but you like it.
I don't know if it's Asperger's or what, but I don't like anything that I don't understand firsthand. And so a lot of people tell me that makes me totally unsuited to be a poet because it's all analytic and that just, they say that goes against the whole grain of the stuff, but oh well. Steve.
Let me just clarify one thing. Since you referred to our story, we moved the poets off of that table because we were out of room, like you said. But we put those skinny spines at eye level, which was the idea. That's the shelves are at eye level. Also, we tripled the size of the poetry section. And then finally, we're the only store doing a lot of poetry readings. So.
And I'm hoping that mine is still on for the 25th of May. It may not.
I'm not sure you're on the calendar, to tell you the truth.
Fred, thank you for your presentation, and where can I find the Martha Graham quote?
I think if you just Google Martha Graham, it'll probably come up. There's a singer I listen to called Sarah Bareilles, and she's an independent singer, and the title of her latest album is The Blessed Unrest, and that turned me on to the quote. Fred?
I really enjoyed your talk quite a bit, but I failed to answer my one fundamental question that I had coming into here. What is the definition of poetry? Because it's very unclear, and a lot of things they say in the opening sentence about free verse and stream of consciousness.
I think poetry might be best defined by negation, a negative definition, but not prose, and that sounds like a cop-out. But really, as I said, we attach the labels based upon the physical look. It's a very superficial classification system. It's odd, but we like things simple. We like dichotomies. We like things in boxes. We like simple labels that we can just and forget about. So I can't give you a good, satisfying answer to that. Yes.
Dan, I will check out the reprintability of the Martha Graham quote, and I'll get it into the Sage next month,
Okay.
and we can reprint it.
It lifts me up.
It's a great quote.
It is. It is. Thank you.
I personally think that the best prose writers are ones that have the intensity and concentration of a poet. That focus really makes a difference in prose writing as well. Which I just put on our website on Facebook, if anybody else wants to go on there and go like, help get the word out that our group is here. Of course, we've got our workshop on blogging after this, and if you want to volunteer to help with the chemo book, please come